and also whereby the principle of the sword in its vital functions in confronting and protecting regarding sin through nationalism are further manifest. Now, by way of the text for seeing this in the early stages of Genesis, we saw this first in Genesis 3:24, and then we've traced it up through Genesis 11. Though not part of God's original creation, civil government and nationalism became necessary for the protection of mankind. But because of the potential hindrances to God's desire for direct accessibility and accountability to Him that is posed by civil government, we need to be able to discern, that we need to be able to see and understand. We have traced out the essentials of the divine viewpoint and human viewpoint of civil government and nationalism as this basis of truly discerning good and bad according to God's intent. Now, by way of a quick recap, here is how we could characterize the elements of divine viewpoint and human viewpoint regarding this matter, and which offer a basic practical framework for evaluating how particular systems of government align one way or the other, including a passage that captures the essence of each of these systems I've included this week. So first, divine viewpoint, the essential passage there is in Psalm 33:12a, how blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. So there, as we've developed it, we've summarized the principles of a divine viewpoint perspective as a basis of good government, or in keeping with God's will. God, we have to see that God is the sovereign creator and savior to whom each individual is accountable regarding salvation and obedience. And this goes to the population at large. A nation whose God is the Lord is aligned with this. God, and secondly, God is the sovereign creator and ruler of all nations. And this goes to the leadership of a nation, who dispenses authority in keeping with his will, which must be exercised accordingly in relation to distinct people groups. So the leadership has to be oriented to God and understand that they're accountable to Him and exercise authority accordingly in keeping with the principles of a relationship with God and walking with Him. And of course, this is done within individual national entities. Finally, Israel, we have to see, a nation has to see that Israel is God's chosen nation to and through whom He will ultimately fulfill His promise to Abraham. A nation can end up on either side of that depending on their posture toward Israel. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. Okay, on the human viewpoint side, we looked at Matthew 20:25 as an essential principle. And we see here that Jesus said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them." That's a practical outworking of things that are in the heart. And what are those things that are in the heart that drive this? Well, first, God is irrelevant, therefore there is no need to regard Him. Second, again, God is irrelevant, if not, and this is to the leadership level, first is the general population. God is irrelevant, if not the top enemy, as you see in Psalm 2. Man is the highest authority, therefore, which should be lorded over national populations for their good, as determined by its leaders and unto global conformity. This is not just that the human viewpoint does not respect the boundaries or the outworkings of government internally, nor does it respect the national distinctions that God has established and desires to have preserved. And finally, Israel has no special place in the world order, but rather should be regarded with contempt. And of course, parenthetically, that's in keeping with hostility toward God, which therefore is represented in His will. Hostility toward His will, which is the case relative to Israel. Okay, so you will note that there is no specific divine prescription for a certain form of government. The ultimate basis of a specific government's alignment with good is judged according to these principles. So it's not confined to the nature of a particular structure of government. It has to do with the people and the leadership of that nation, and where do they stand with respect to God's will and their relationship and fellowship with him in that. But that doesn't mean that we don't find legitimate distinctions that may be measured in the relative merits of different forms of government and their individual approaches to governance according to their inherent alignment to biblical principles, whether in the most basic form, i.e. the general orientation of a nation to God as the Lord, or in more particular biblical detail. And that more particular detail in large measure is embodied in prescriptions of government given by God to Israel. You will see those things interwoven in the way different governments choose to create their constitutions and their other governing documents. Inasmuch as God did call a particular people group to himself and set them apart, to whom he dictated certain laws for the administration of their national life, it would be reasonable to assess these things more broadly as to their relevance. In saying that, we have to carefully qualify this with the understanding that God did not call any other nation in the way that he did Israel. We may see Israel as a theocracy, but there is no cause to directly apply these things to any other nation to this extent, or to ascribe many of the distinctives intended by God for Israel to another nation, or to the church, as many have done and are doing. But to the extent we find sound principles sourced directly to God himself that are relevant to governmental structure and governing protocols, it would certainly be wise to consult and embrace them where appropriate. Naturally, would it not? Last time we considered this according to the basics of the threefold breakdown of the Mosaic Code, the Mosaic Law. We see this in the moral, the civil, and the ceremonial codes. The ceremonial code deals specifically with the detailed provisions of the religious life of Israel, from the function of the Levitical priesthood to the various individual responsibilities related to ceremonial and spiritual cleansing. I use the term religious only in the sense that this involved many religious or many what we would call rituals according to the particular need or to a regular observance. Underlying this, though, was the way in which God carefully established these things to direct the focus relationally between him and the children of Israel. So we understand religion is not the answer. Sometimes this is more of a description of its external nature in terms of the ritualistic nature of things, not the spirit of the things that God had embedded in these practices. Now, though these were codified, they were not intended. These were not intended. Oops. I have to go back. I think I had to restart this. So. These were not intended to be a function of government or subject to governmental intrusion, but were otherwise to be protected, as it were. You could say this is an umbrella, protected. These were to be protected by a context of civil agency that enforced certain moral laws and other stipulations targeted at preserving certain rights, like the right to life, right to liberty, the right to private property ownership. And our ultimate target for application of what we're building as we're moving along is America and our present orientation as status as Christian Americans, citizens, as it were. Now, there will be a lot that this will involve, from founding principles to our present predicament. But in putting down a marker here, you can see where our religious liberties were rightly ascribed to God as their author, but then protected by our civil code. We find the important basis for separation of church and state, which is intended not to be separation of state from God, but for keeping the state out of church business, which we see in the Jewish system here. So that's just kind of an advanced, practical connection that we're going to develop in more detail as we go forward. Now, I'm going to now move more quickly through a history of human government, drawing exclusively at this point on the biblical record, which really, for this, is all we need. My aim is not to get bogged down in the details, so this may be characterized as a view from space, really. Looking at this within a dispensational framework, I found this interesting. In finding this particular graphic that depicts the 7, and they're color-coded if you wanted to do the counting there, the 7 dispensations that we're familiar with, which are innocence, conscience, human government, promise, law, which then includes, as you see in the color shading there, the tribulation, where God resumes the Jewish age, as it were. Then you have the church, and then the kingdom, the millennium. But interestingly and helpfully, you see the abiding presence of human government, right? From the time it was instituted throughout the other dispensations until, when? Of course, until the human side of government is supplanted by the divine side of earthly government, which will be the millennial reign of Christ. I'm looking forward to that. Naturally, we will also be free of sin in our bodies at that time, which will make it even better. Now, from a time frame standpoint, we may consider systems of government we're going to consider systems of government from Babel to the law. So we're going to be looking at human government when you go from here to here. Then we're going to be looking at government from the beginning of the law to the church age, and then forward. So there's 3 segments here we're going to take a quick look at. And it is going to be pretty cursory at this stage. And when I say that, there is a whole lot of historical information available in terms of human history side of things, where you just couldn't get through it all in a lifetime. If you want to look at the various outworkings of the issues of nations, forms of civil government, how they were formed, and in what ways they interacted, I mean, there's just so much that you could have done. Again, all of those things, if you were to go through it, can be evaluated in terms of the basic fundamental principles of human viewpoint and divine viewpoint. So we're going to stick with that, and therefore within the biblical record there's enough to work with. Now, in the pre-law period, so we would see this period here, in the pre-law period, the Bible speaks of kings and kingdoms, and I'm going to look at this as I go from the Gentile point of view and from the Jewish Israel point of view. So when it comes to the Gentile world, we find things described in terms of kings and kingdoms. Turn to Genesis 14, and this is simply descriptive. 14, there's a whole narrative, of course, that this is attached to. However, it doesn't get really in its content to what we're looking at. So I'm just using this descriptively. Genesis 14, 1. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All I'm showing there is king, 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 king. And they're of distinct empires. They may form alliances, but they are warring amongst them, each other. Now, and this passage comes not long after Babel and may be taken as representative of the conventional norms of human government among the Gentile world. And the whole thing is a king spoke of the consolidation of power in a single sovereign. Now, there would have been various layers of government below the king, but they would not have been separate and equal, as we are familiar with. The lower officials were subject to appointment by the king, and they were directly answerable to him, and they were subject to recall or at-will dismissal. Gentile leadership and societies were furthermore characterized by paganism, according naturally to their rejection of the true and living God, and the by-fault filling of this vacuum with God's, small g, created after man's own image and man's carnal tendencies. If you've ever done a study of Roman mythology, any mythology, aren't they just like human beings on steroids? I mean, right? They are created after man's own image and granted certain superpowers, right? So these were the nature of these countries, these pagan countries. We see then a commingling, also importantly, of the authority of secular religion with human agency in government, which simply amplified the fleshly orientation that we've seen of this lording over the people in the possession and the exercise of power. So you see a commingling of the religious and the civil, and the leveraging of that to greater lording over the people. Now, by way of a passing note, you might have come to mind, what about King Melchizedek? Well, he's an exclusion from this. He's a unique person in this whole complex and in this immediate context. He comes in to this context here with respect to Abraham getting involved in this circumstance to deliver his nephew Lot, and then in the aftermath, of course, Abraham, in worshiping God, does so in part through Melchizedek as he comes on scene. Now, Melchizedek had a unique role in God's plan that excluded him from the category of Gentile kings that he could wrongly be lumped into. And there will be more to say about Melchizedek later. Now, familiarly, we think of Pharaoh as a king. There's a lot written about the pharaohs in the narrative. If there's a lot written about any king, at least early on in the section that we're involved in here. Now, the pharaohs maintained a long-term succession, and it serves as a good example of a familiar biblical character that would be representative of the nature of a Gentile king and his rule during this period, and his nation and government. Now, here is a summary description of the nature and rule of a pharaoh from Britannica.com. I thought this was interesting and succinct. He says, "The Egyptians believed their pharaoh to be the mediator between the gods and the world of men. After death, the pharaoh became divine, identified with Osiris, the father of Horus and god of the dead, and passed on his sacred powers and position to the new pharaoh, his son. The pharaoh's divine status was portrayed in allegorical terms. His uraeus, the snake on his crown, spat flames at his enemies. He was able to trample thousands of the enemy on the battlefield, and he was all-powerful, knowing everything, and controlling nature and fertility. As a divine ruler, the pharaoh was the preserver of the God-given order called Mat. He owned a large portion of Egypt's land and directed its use, was responsible for his people's economic and spiritual welfare, and dispensed justice to his subjects. His will was supreme, and he governed by royal decree. To govern fairly, though, the pharaoh had to delegate responsibility. His chief assistant was the vizier, who, among other duties, was chief justice, head of the treasury, and overseer of all records. Below this central authority, the royal will of the Pharaoh was administered through the nomes, or provinces, into which Upper and Lower Egypt were divided. Couldn't help but think that, he was speaking here from Britannica, certainly not from a divine viewpoint perspective and biblically vetted here, but he speaks of the chief assistant. Who was a chief assistant who we know of? Yeah, thought that's kind of interesting. And that goes to some other points that we're going to get to eventually. Now, that's the Gentile world. For Israel, prior to the law, we find no reference to a civil structure. We must remember that in number, Israel had not attained what we may call a national stature until the 70 members, or 75, depending on where you see it referred to, the 75 members of Jacob's family, until they became a large horde in Egypt at the point of the Exodus. Up to this point, Israel functioned under a patriarchal structure, which simply expanded with the growing population. But inasmuch as Israel was influenced by the surrounding pagan nations, at every stage of their existence, from small clan to large nation at the point that they left Egypt, they had adopted the pagan practices of their surrounding nations, including their idolatry. Now, any official capacities of civil agency among Israel appeared to function within the tribal divisions. And the 12 tribal divisions, those were very clearly kept distinct, numbered several times. So it's very important and remains important to the nation today in terms of their heritage. But anyway, any official civil agency was kept within those tribal divisions. And this became a pressing need when Moses assumed overall leadership as God's appointed agent of deliverance. Now, at the urging of his father-in-law, Jethro, Moses delegated much of the growing burden of civil government to others. Turn ahead to Exodus chapter 18, verse 19, where we see this. This is Jethro speaking to Moses. Listen now to my voice. I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. Stand before God for the people, so that you may bring the difficulties to God. And you shall teach them the statutes and the laws, and show them the way in which they must walk and the work they must do. Moreover, you shall select from all the people able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10s. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. The principle Jethro is speaking to here is the leadership had to be in a right relationship and posture for God to be able to undertake whatever level of civil authority was being delegated. And let them judge the people at all times. Then it will be that every great matter that they shall bring to you, but every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they themselves shall judge. So it will be easier for you, for they will bear the burden with you. If you do this thing and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all this people will also go to their place in peace. So this is late now in the period we were evaluating. It was a structure that became necessary because of the extent of the nation, the burden that that represented. And you see the seed work in place here of how the divine viewpoint of government is to be undertaken. And so this is just in advance, as it were, of the detailed stipulations of the law being given to Israel relative to civil government that would supersede or enhance these particular provisions here. Now, a note on the positive side, we spoke already of him, but we find Joseph, who was earlier in this period, in remaining faithful to God, was preserved in righteousness, even as he served in the highest appointed official position below Pharaoh. thoroughly pagan leader, thoroughly pagan nation, as we read a sampling of. Joseph engaged in governmental activity, even making laws in this pagan administration, while maintaining a righteous walk with God. And he offers an example among others that we're going to be looking at later as we seek to discern practical lessons for our perspective and application in the pagan nation that we know today as America. Looking forward now, we're going back. I'll go back to, here we are. Now we're going to go to the period of law. Big changes. And, but not so much for the Gentiles. We find a continuation of the king as the top sovereign, which came to incorporate other designations going toward the end or along the way. What did we end up with at the end of the Jewish age? We had the emperor, the Roman emperor, with respect to the Roman Empire. Again, there were underlings at various levels with various territorial authorities and otherwise administrative duties. And there were cases where a queen served in the capacity as sovereign, not just as wife of the king, but as the top official. Not as many, of course, but that was also the case. And it involved the same basic governmental protocols. The gender change didn't change the nature of the government. Now, as you consult various biblical narratives, you see under the king, the kingdom or the king form of government, i.e. when you're looking at the Babylonian or the Persian empires, for instance, you find under the king provincial satraps, governors, princes, etc., which included administrative and judicial branches. When you look at the emperor form of government, you have, under the emperor, you have kings, proconsuls, and governors. But irrespective of form, these continue to follow the pagan pattern of centralized authority with a commingling of religious practice and authority. Subjects were not typically free to follow their personal choices in faith and worship, among many other things, without repercussions. Government wielded a heavy hand and would frequently target believers in the true and living God. Turn to Daniel chapter 3. Now, flip back and forth here. Okay, we're going to just read the first 6 verses. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony, with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." As Paul Harvey said, you know the rest of the story. I'm just trying to capture the essence of the nature of pagan government in this period. And this might be dramatic in some respects, but probably representative of what I had described. There's, of course, a lot more to the story regarding specifically the characters of Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel for our later application, but for now we're simply going to find another example of this typical pagan form of Gentile government, and that continued to characterize the world up to this point and beyond during the age of law, or the Jewish age. Now let's look at Israel. For Israel, and through them, the world, wherever these things were embraced, life was dramatically altered with the giving of the law, including in areas of civil government. We have seen how God provided comprehensively for the spiritual, social, and legal function of his nation in the code, while preserving the primary objective of personal relationship and access to him as their Savior and Lord. Now this section is split up also in divisions that show some progression along the way in civil government anyway. First, we have the time under Moses, which was, the 40 years and maybe not much longer, right? He wasn't here more than 40 years. So under Moses, and then we'll see a little transition as we go forward. Under Moses, civil governance was introduced according to the elements of the moral and the civil law. We had seen this here. So under the moral and civil law, we see some new stipulations in much more detail relative to civil government and its agencies. Its provisions embodied the righteousness, the holiness, the grace, the mercy, and the justice of God. In other words, it reflected God's character. As we've noted, the specific stipulations relate to the preservation of the divine institutions of marriage and family, the protection of the right to life and of the right to private ownership of property, while upholding the free exercise of man's will to seek and to follow the Lord, or not. Of course, there were consequences because of their special relationship with God for that. While the ceremonial or religious provisions were maintained under the Levitical priesthood from this point forward, the civil provisions continued to be delegated at this time to the tribal leaders according to the patriarchal system. And then, as we go forward, after Moses, turn to Judges 2 while we're talking, or I'm talking here. Once Israel had settled in the land, and more specifically at the point where of Joshua's death, along with the rest of the generation that had entered the land, Israel went all in on paganism, more fully adopting the practices of the Gentile nations around and them and the remnant of the Gentile people that was among them. So we're going to read through this progressively as we look at this, starting in verse 10. Wait a minute. Joshua 1, I believe, right? No. Judges. That's why it looked a little different when I was in Joshua. Yeah, so in Judges chapter 2, verse 10. When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, and another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel, then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them. And they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served Baals and Ashtoreths. So here we see what has transpired after the death of Joshua, people having been in and settled the land to the extent they had up to the point of Joshua's death. And this is what had happened. And then God immediately strikes them with judgment. Look at verses 14 and 15. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel,
So he delivered them into the hands of plunderers who despoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed. Of course, the swearing of this happening by the Lord, of course, you find in the very provisions of the exhortation to abide in his law or not. And he has laid out in detail the consequences of not following the Lord. And this is what the author is speaking to here. Now, a quick point to make here that goes to God's purposes in nations is his using them through war and aggression to bring judgment against other nations. And these fulfill important purposes of God in protecting against total isolation from him in the fullness of a spirit of self-sufficiency that we saw that overtook the population at Babel. It also serves the purpose of eliminating irreversible evil and also in fostering conditions that expose man to his own weaknesses and his vulnerabilities, and that importantly, therefore, could encourage man to turn, or in the case of Israel, return to the Lord. So, wars, rumors of wars will go on, and God coordinates and choreographs these things for purposes that are ultimately to man's corporate best interests in some of the ways that I've cited. So, why did God raise up nations? Well, that is one of the purposes, to continue to have them available to dispense with judgment throughout the world in various ways in which he needs to do so among the nations, including what we're seeing here for his own people, Israel. Back to our context, God now introduces a new national office in his response to the people's cries for deliverance, God having succeeded in achieving at least one of the purposes for this oppression, just to have his people turn to him. So let's read now in verse 16. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Now, this could be characterized as a civil agency, but the judge's role was largely military in severing the oppression of the enemies into whose hands the Lord had delivered them, but it was also spiritual in exhorting the people to righteousness, not in encroaching on the Levitical priesthood, but in being that leader who follows the Lord, an example for the people of a nation whose God is the Lord. And this began, and when it says plural, raised up judges, this simply points to a lengthy cycle of rebellion and restoration through successive judges, which included one woman, by the way, Deborah, you might remember. But let's see this further in verse 17. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods and bowed down to them. They turned quickly from the way in which their fathers walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do so. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved with pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. And it came to pass when the judge was dead, they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers by following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn ways. And this goes on, and then at the end, I just want to read for sake of time. Verse 21, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, so that through them I may test Israel whether they will keep the ways of the Lord, to walk in them as their fathers kept them or not. Therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out immediately, nor did he deliver them into the hand of Joshua. Note how we are left, we're kind of let in here, in this last section here, on the sovereignty of God's side of the failure of Joshua and Israel to completely drive the nations out of the land. We may have looked at that as a failure on Israel's part, but it's actually God had a purpose in that on the divine sovereignty side, right? Left them there to be a constant source of challenge to Israel as to whether they would follow paganism or stand firm in his law. So this now we see the Judges. So that shows and gives an introduction to the period of the Judges. Then we move on, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 8. We're back in this passage now. We had been here before. And moving on to another segment of civil government advancement in Israel. Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also." Samuel was the last of the functioning line of judges. It says that he passed this on to his sons. Of course, that didn't last very long, right? They were not raised up, as it were, by God himself. As you know, Samuel was also officially a prophet. But now at the end of his life, as the people looked ahead to the prospects of his sons taking over as judges, Israel seeks what all the nations have always had, their own king. As we see in God's response, this strikes directly at the heart of his will regarding his people. As we see with the pagan nations, a human leader would consolidate all power to himself in a way that would distract from and disrupt the direct relationship of the people with God. As we've also seen, God largely, though, allows man to follow his free choices and experience the consequences of those choices. God granted their wish, which must have nevertheless greatly pained him. Israel shifted to a monarchy with predictable consequences. The first king, Saul, went apostate. David may be known as a man after God's own heart. We may look at him in many ways as a spiritual example and encouragement, but his reign was ultimately marked by instability in the kingdom relative to his failures. And Solomon may have topped Saul in some ways in his ultimate apostasy, chasing after his thousands of wives, leading then to a shaky transition and a split in the kingdom from which Israel never recovered. The northern kingdom was marked by the universal evil of its kings, with maybe a faithfulness of small remnants, as there always are. But its course in that direction led to national exile under Assyria in 721 BC. The southern kingdom, Judah, because of the installment along the way of a number of good kings in terms of proper orientation to God and his will, lasted a bit longer, but ultimately went out to captivity under the Babylonians in 586 BC. Paganism had come to thoroughly contaminate the leadership and largely the people. Now, in exile and after exile, we only find a restoration on the part of the southern kingdom, though it never recovered its independence in terms of national self-governance. To the extent Judah was allowed to return and reestablish itself in Jerusalem, its relative autonomy was only local. And while in exile and after, we find that Jewish leaders were installed in positions within the Gentile structure variously. In exile, we note the elevation of Daniel within the administration of Nebuchadnezzar and other kings that followed. And post-exile, we read of Governor Zerubbabel and Governor Nehemiah, which appear to be positions that remained, of course, ultimately under overall Gentile rule. And the lack of civil autonomy was extended at the point of absorption into the pagan Roman Empire. Any civil government roles for Jews in this empire were minor. A general tolerance of the Roman leadership of the Jews under this arrangement prevailed. In fact, through Herod's initiative, we see and know that the temple was extensively refurbished and enlarged, and that was around 20 to 19 BC. This effort had a largely or a distinctly secular motive and flair to it, but it did not deter Christ himself from regarding Herod's temple as the legitimate seat of Jewish worship even in his day. So there's some things that you could look at there to see in how we see God's viewpoint of things and how we tend to look at things. Anyway, that's where we should have left it 5 minutes ago, but we're closing out now. Today we've traced out broadly the history of Gentile and Jewish governmental systems without, of course, the extensive structural details that exist for us to look at further. Our emphasis is on the way in which these things that we looked at exhibit the essential principles of divine viewpoint and human viewpoint. And for that, we see by the end of the Jewish age, any form of government emulating divine viewpoint wasn't prominent. Gentile nations had been and remained thoroughly paganized, and Israel had itself collapsed under the weight of paganism, and its autonomy had been crushed. Anything by way of Judeo values were, of course, administered officially by the priesthood at that time in a very corrupted, legalistic fashion. Next time we're going to pick up with the church age, and there shouldn't be a whole lot to look at there. And then we ultimately want to get to the application of these things. So we'll develop a little bit more of the background. Hopefully it won't take too much longer, and we'll be able to get to that. All right, let's close. Father, we thank you for just the understanding we have, to the extent that we have it, of your sovereignty in all things, that we can retreat to as we should and need to. And beyond that, just the plan in your sovereignty that encompasses all the rest of your character that you've poured out toward us through Christ, and through him we have access directly to you and a relationship to you, and have access to understanding through the ministry of the Spirit of those things we need to know and relate to, that we might walk closely with you and stand firm in this world, which is now under Satan's control and direction, which is apparent in just about every way we look around. And so we certainly need to be grounded. Thank you that we can. Thank you that you have provided this for us to be our portion. And we ask, thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.